Well, hey there and welcome back to Heimler's History. Now, we've been going through Unit 7 of the AP U.S. History curriculum, and in the last video, we talked about the American entry into World War II and everything that meant for the home front. But now it's time to talk about the actual fighting of the war, so if you're ready to get them brain cows milked Allied style, then let's get to it. So I'll go ahead and ruin the ending for you. The Allies, of which the United States was a part, won World War II. And I ruined it because our learning objective for this video went ahead and ruined it for me. Explain the causes and effects of the victory of the United States and its allies over the Axis powers. So yeah, the Allies won, but let's see if we can figure out exactly how they did it. First of all, just like in World War I, when the United States entered the war, it signaled a decisive tip in favor of the Allied powers over the Axis powers. And once Americans were committed to the cause, many saw our entry into the war as a fight for the survival of democracy, and more to the point, freedom against fascist totalitarianism, especially the Nazi kind. And this commitment was only strengthened later in the war as German atrocities against the Jews came to light. You see, as Allied soldiers took more and more Axis territory, they began finding Jewish concentration camps in which Jews were condemned to forced labor if they were lucky, and death if they were not. Now, the full scale of this atrocity against the Jews only came to light after the war, and it was discovered that somewhere in the neighborhood of 6 million Jews had been killed in these camps and as a result of other campaigns by the Germans. Eventually, this tragedy was named the Holocaust, and its brutality only served to justify to Americans that their involvement in the war was just and right. Okay, I'm getting ahead of myself just a little bit, so let's go back to the beginning of the U.S. entry into World War II. At first, most of the American effort was poured into the Pacific theater of the war, largely because it was Japan who had been the aggressor against the United States. And during the early months of this effort, Japan was very much winning against the U.S. However, two battles turned the tide of this theater toward the United States. The first was the Battle of the Coral Sea, and the second was the Battle of Midway, both of which happened in 1942. Now, it's not going to be important for you to know the details of these battles, but it will be very important for you to know that as a result of these battles, the U.S. was able to push back the Japanese, who had conquered a large portion of key strategic Pacific territories. Okay, let's hit pause on the Pacific theater and go check in with the European theater of the war. So before June of 1944, the main defender against the encroaching Germans was the Russians. So understandably, the Russians urged Britain and the United States to open up a second front in the West against Germany. So Stalin, Churchill, and Roosevelt met in November of 1943 at the Tehran Conference, where the plans for opening a second front were laid. It would become known as the D-Day Invasion on the Normandy beaches of northern France. Now, at this point, the Germans had conquered and occupied France and established a puppet government subservient to its will. And so to remedy this problem, on June 6, 1944, the D-Day Invasion began, and it was the largest amphibious invasion in the history of the world. Over 200,000 Allied troops landed that day, and in the following weeks, more than 1 million followed. And a month later, after heavy casualties, Allied forces pushed the Germans back and liberated France. From there, the Allies made their final push towards Berlin. Hitler's last major offensive assault against the Allied armies bearing down upon them was known as the Battle of the Bulge in the winter of 1944 to 1945. The Bulge referred to a strategy of driving a wedge between the ranks of the Allied armies in Belgium and therefore creating the occasion to defeat them. And ultimately, despite a heavy death toll on both sides, the strategy failed, and that was the final toll of the bell for Hitler's advances. And after that, Allied forces began pushing closer and closer to Berlin, and on April 30th, Hitler took his own life, and a week later, on May 7th, Germany surrendered, a day which became known as VE Day, or Victory in Europe Day. Alright, now let's jump back into the Pacific theater and see what's happening over there. After the decisive Allied victory at the Battle of Midway, the U.S. forces engaged in what's called an island hopping campaign. Essentially, this just meant that they bypassed the heavily fortified Japanese-occupied islands in favor of smaller, less strategic islands, and in doing so, they effectively cut off the Japanese supply line. And this strategy was a success because by cutting off all of those supply lines, the more heavily fortified Japanese holdings essentially withered for lack of supplies. Now, the Pacific theater of war was brought to an end by the dropping of 2 atomic bombs on Japan. So in April of 1945, just as plans were being made for an offensive against Japan, Franklin Roosevelt died in his 4th term in office. His vice president, Harry Truman, took his place, and the responsibility for the defeat of Japan was laid upon him. And upon being briefed, Truman learned that the U.S. and its collaborators had already developed and tested nuclear bombs under a secretive experiment known as the Manhattan Project. And this was a truly awe-inspiring and terrible weapon. One atomic bomb had the destructive power equivalent of 15 kilotons of dynamite. And so Truman made the decision to use this weapon against Japan in order to force its surrender. And on August 6, 1945, the U.S. dropped the first atomic bomb on the Japanese city of Hiroshima, and then 3 days later dropped another one on Nagasaki. And it was truly devastating. Like, over the course of about 2 months, conservative estimates placed the death toll for those two bombs at 140,000, and half of those died in the moment of the blast, while others died of injuries and radiation poisoning later. And since those days, there's been an endless debate over the morality of that move. Like, on the one hand, it was argued that the Japanese would never surrender and a land-based invasion would be extremely costly in terms of American lives. On the other hand, it was argued that these were civilian populations, although there was some strategic military value to the targets. Whether we'll ever settle that debate, I don't know, but the outcome was clear. On September 2nd, 1945, Japan officially surrendered in what became known as VJ Day, or Victory in Japan Day, and the war was over. Okay, that's what you need to know about Unit 7, Topic 13 of the AP U.S. History curriculum. And if you need more help getting an A in your class and a 5 on your exam in May, then click right here and grab a review pack. If you were helped by this video and want me to keep making them, then subscribe, and I shall oblige. Heimler out.